Deep in the French National Archives in Paris, quietly resting alongside hundreds of historical treasures and priceless artefacts, sit almost 20,000 notebooks. They don't look like much, but inside are 200,000 handwritten notes, scrawled into history by a frustrated people at the behest of a French leader desperate to halt a growing crisis. History buffs may be forgiven for thinking about an infamous and far older set of notebooks, penned in the heady early days of the French Revolution. But these notebooks were written far more recently. Gathered from more than 16,000 town halls across France in early 2019, the notebooks are full of complaints, concerns and suggestions for the French government, written by frustrated citizens from quaint French villages and bustling towns, from the sun-soaked Mediterranean coast in the south to the lush Ardennes forest in the north. Many express feelings of being forgotten, left behind by their nation's leaders in a rapidly changing world. These messages were intended to shape the future policies of Emmanuel Macron and were to be unveiled to the nation as a beacon of Republican transparency. They were meant to address the mounting frustrations that erupted into the Yellow Vest protest movement. But in the years since, despite grand promises, the notebooks have vanished from public view. Critics say these concerns and cries for help were simply written down, digitised, and then ignored, bundled up and stored away in the National Archives. 5 years on from the protests, Emmanuel Macron is now calling on those same French citizens to fight back against those pushing for a far right-wing parliament. The question is, will he receive the same response when he calls for help? From the lands of the Kulin Nation, I'm Emma Hoy, and this is Leave It to the Experts. It's nighttime in Paris, Saturday, November 17, 2018, and the iconic Champs-Élysées glows red in the reflection of climbing flames. Sprawled across the cobblestones of the usually picturesque Paris Avenue are planks of wood set ablaze by protesters wearing fluorescent yellow high-vis vests. The well-trained Paris riot police mobilise as the smell of tear gas stings the air. There are clashes with protesters across the day, and the injury count climbs to the hundreds. This is a scene taking place in cities across France. In some towns, they block toll roads and petrol depots. In Le Puy-en-Velay, southwest of the city of Lyon, someone throws a Molotov cocktail at a police station. Nationwide, 2 people have died, and more than 600 have been injured after 300,000 people across the country have flooded the cities, built barricades, and blocked roads. The movement had been growing, dubbed the Yellow Vest protests, so named because of the eponymous jackets worn by the protesters. A movement that began with no leader, no political affiliations, from a Facebook protest group advocating for lower petrol prices and raging against what the author called the government's anti-car policies.
Well, yeah, as you said, it started with the tax gas and people, the middle class saying enough is enough. Always the same people are paying the taxes.
At one point, 74% of French people said they supported the movement. Right-wing political leader Marine Le Pen, Macron's largest political rival, would describe the group as too poor to be rich and too rich to be poor.
While many of the protests started out peaceful, the violence seems to be escalating. On January 5th, protesters wearing yellow vests and some dressed in black attacked a government building in Paris.
The protests would continue every week throughout 2019, with French citizens in their thousands showing up to rally against the Macron government. They'd clash with police, they'd go home, and they'd return a week later to do it all again.
And the Yellow Vest movement has taken a violent turn once again. One person was killed today as France witnessed the 6th Saturday of nationwide protests.
A movement that began with petrol prices, turning into a cry of rage from citizens against their diminishing place within the French project.
And a perception that the government of President Macron has been more interested in easing the tax burden on the wealthy than on ordinary French people. Now, that's
the movement that risked bringing Macron's presidency to its knees was then swiftly replaced by another dilemma.
The French Health Minister Agnès Buzyn has confirmed that there are 3 cases of patients with coronavirus in the country.
The pandemic, however, didn't quell the dissatisfaction felt amongst many French people. In fact, It made some of the more extreme edges of the protest movement rage even harder against government lockdowns. The whole movement was morphing in new directions, but its genesis was a boilover at least a decade in the making. Since the global financial crash in 2008, the French have suffered from stagnant wages and austerity.
The French government is going to try to save $25 billion during the course of 2012 with an aim to getting to zero deficit by 2016.
While the concentration of wealth increased, particularly in the affluent quarters of aristocratic Paris, millions across the country struggled more and more to make ends meet. So began a narrative familiar with working-class struggles around the world. People worked harder to receive less, finding themselves going backwards financially when they felt they should be moving forwards. Alongside this struggle, immigration to France spikes. In 2023, the nation issued a record 320,000 residence permits to non-European immigrants, while also receiving more claims for asylum than ever before.
Centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron appearing with his wife, celebrating a decisive victory over the far-right's Marine Le Pen.
With no party, no political apparatus, just a grassroots movement, Emmanuel Macron has defied convention.
Just a year before the Yellow Vest protests, 39-year-old centrist politician Emmanuel Macron was elected president of France. The son of a physician and a professor, he graduated from one of France's most elite schools and completed a master's degree, later working at Rothschild's bank before taking a senior role in former President François Hollande's staff. Macron was charismatic, sharp and economically savvy, but his tenure was marked with gaffes that would later nurture the rage of the Yellow Vest protesters. In 2014, he said many workers at a bankrupt abattoir were illiterate. In 2018, with unemployment at 10%, Macron told a young unemployed gardener it was easy to get a job. All he needed to do was cross the road. Dubbed by some as the president of the rich, Macron scrapped France's wealth tax, a move which then failed to deliver on the economic growth and jobs he'd promised that would follow. And he later lobbied to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 in the face of rampant opposition from the French people. Lacking a majority in Parliament, Macron pushed the reforms through by invoking a constitutional exemption to pass laws without a parliamentary vote, despite the fact that 78% of French people disagreed with Macron's decision to do so.
Tonight, fires across France. Hundreds of thousands taking to the streets, outraged over French President Emmanuel Macron's unyielding determination to reform pensions here.
Like on many other occasions, the pension protests saw Macron come off as defensive and unforgiving. He insisted order would be restored without compromise. When it became apparent the protesters weren't going anywhere, he tried apologising and appealing to moderation. And then came the concessions. Now the seeds of dissent planted by the Yellow Vests may finally be coming home to decimate Emmanuel Macron's presidency. A poll conducted during the 2022 presidential election indicated that 44% of the Yellow Vest movement voted for Marine Le Pen in the first round, while others had favoured smaller and disparate candidates from across the political spectrum. In 2019, Le Pen had already tried to leverage the support of the protest movement for the European elections, calling the movement a healthy popular revolt. She built her base by heeding the call of the disenfranchised and frustrated within France. She offered them a vision, blaming Macron and migrants for the problems they faced. Le Pen then pushed Macron to a second round.
Elation underneath the Eiffel Tower tonight. Emmanuel Macron's followers celebrating the first French president to be re-elected in 20 years.
But while Macron remained president, Le Pen and her party were targeting the French parliament.
In her speech last night, she acknowledged what she was able to accomplish, acknowledging that the National Rally Party is really the main opposition party here in France.
Then, in June of this year, around 1/3 of French voters in the European Union elections threw their support behind the National Rally, a party led by Marine Le Pen and rising star, 28-year-old Jordan Bardella. The National Rally has built its platform railing against immigration, globalisation and cost of living pressures. With the tide turning against Macron's government, the Prime Minister called a snap parliamentary election, which just finished its first round. The early results are a wipeout for Macron's centrist alliance.
From France, where the country's far-right party is celebrating what appears to be a dramatic win over President Emmanuel Macron's centrist party.
They came in third with 20% of the vote, trailing the National Rally at 33% and the left-wing New Popular Front at 28%. The first round dictates which seats were won by candidates with an outright majority. That settled just 78 of the 577 seats in France's National Assembly. The second round will now see the remaining seats decided in a runoff between the top two candidates, as well as anyone who received more than 12.5% of votes in that constituency. Whoever gets the most votes in this round wins the seat. The National Rally and allies are predicted to win anywhere between 200 and 260 seats, which would bring them close to the 289-seat majority needed to control the National Assembly. No matter what, Macron will keep his job as president. His term runs until 2027, but if his party loses nearly all of its seats in the parliament, Macron will have little control over what policy is made and passed. Although Macron holds the power to appoint his prime minister, his choice must be approved by the parliament. So if the National Rally wins at the scale it's projected to, it will be in a position to force Macron to appoint its pick, 28-year-old National Rally leader Jordan Bardella.
The far-right leader was born in 1995 in the Parisian suburb of Seine-Saint-Denis in a low-income housing complex.
A young man standing on the brink of power. He could be the next Prime Minister of France. But Jordan Bardella, he's got to convince the country he's a mainstream politician, not a right-wing extremist.
The National Rally have made huge gains across demographics. Their core voter base, built on a strange blend of people over 50 from low socioeconomic rural communities who are struggling to make ends meet, and voters under 24, charmed by the grounded working-class roots of the youthful Bardella.
His image speaks to young people.
I think he has a lot of ideas for young people. He's speaking out for young people on our future, about the things that will affect us.
It's a strange mix, and it's allowed the National Rally to at once position itself as the party of French traditionalists and a counterculture movement.
So the national theme of, Frenchness, we are French, we want to stay French, is certainly very present in his discourse, but it's hard to assess whether this is the drawing thing for young people especially.
As the votes roll in, it seems the next wave of domestic French politics will be hostile, a battle between the far right and far left. It's a future that Emmanuel Macron fears, leading the president to say it could cause a civil war. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
So, is Macron's warning over a civil war a vision into France's future, or just the last gasp from a president who's become disconnected from his formerly strong voter base? Let's ask our expert. Jean Bogais is an associate professor at the University of Sydney. He's a sociologist researching culture, political violence, and international security. Professor Bogais, let's start with an overview of what you're witnessing in France at the moment.
Well, we are looking at history being made in French politics. I have never seen a situation like this in my lifetime. What we're seeing is the Rassemblement National, the extreme right party, continuing on the journey that it started over 40 years ago, but about 20 years under the control of Marine Le Pen. And we've seen many, many changes in her approach to politics. Originally, the Front National of her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was extremely anti-Semitic, anti-racist, you name it, it was terrible. But obviously, we have a convergence between her new political views that she claims to have, and also a situation socio-economic and political in France, which is extremely complex and extremely negative also. So we have an electorate that is faced with big problem within, France, cost of living, security, and other factors on the one hand, and a party that come and said, well, we can address some of these issues. And after 20 years, it's very clear that the government, being Republic, socialist, have actually not addressed anything. So it was only logical that this situation would happen. And it certainly did happen. It's happening now.
Certainly you and many other people think that it's a logical progression. But the National Rally and Marine Le Pen have been on the rise gradually for a long time. But the shock of this result has been really clear to a lot of people. A lot of people have been surprised by just how well the party has done. Why do you think that is?
We have a situation in Europe where far-right movement or parties have developed over the last, especially 10, 12 years. And this came on the top of the migrant issue. And that has been a catalyst, actually, for all those movements. What they did was to piggyback on all those problems very rapidly. France is a very depressed country, economically doing very poorly, being affected by security, terrorism, for all sorts of reasons that the French feel have not really anything to do with them. So, people in the street feel, why do we have to contribute to helping economically countries and people who basically have nothing to do with us? So if you put all this together, there is a feeling of negativity, of anger, fear at times. And of course, when President Macron takes this very, very pro-European line, there's a lot of frustration coming. And that's what Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella are using to promote their own agenda.
When you look at the voter profile for the majority of National Rally voters, they largely appear to live outside of the major cities. They have lower wages and education levels. So why do you think the politics of Marine Le Pen's party appeals so much to these demographics?
I think because out of the mine centers, villages have been sort of left vacant because the industry is gone, agriculture is gone. Little things like railway stations are gone. So, there is a demographic change, but there's also a socio-economic change that has emerged and developed over the last 2 decades, which now becomes untenable. And those people have to live there, but they don't have any work. They got problem traveling. Even post office are closed. And in France, because of the multiplicity of small towns, small villages, those issues are important. And that is what Marine Le Pen has been campaigning for years now, in trying to bring the people from country France, old industrial areas, who are dissatisfied with the governments, into a side of politics.
So I guess, as you've said, what we're seeing is this reaction against the politics of the last 3 presidents, but also against urbanization and globalization. But these aren't French phenomena, are they? We see those happening all around the world. But what France does have is a really long history of political protest and reaction against the political mainstream. So how do you see that interplay between cultural identity in France and that sort of political alignment and resistance?
I think we need to go back to secularism. Secularism, which is a byproduct of the revolution, has been challenged in the last 20 years. Secularism meant that of course, a state and religion and a church are different and can never connect. Of course, what we have experienced in the last 10, 15 years is religions, but as far as the French are concerned, religions coming from other parts of the world, different religions, Islamic and so on. So that's where we have a very major problem, because it affects the sheer identity of France. So the cultural identity of France has been challenged with a challenge to secularism. And people are struggling with that.
If President Macron is forced into a cohabitation government with the National Rally, what might we see him do to ensure stable governance? What are some of the challenges in this very historical power-sharing arrangement?
Massive. A cohabitation between two extreme individuals. We need to look at the individuals here. Macron is a technocrat. He believes in systems. He takes this approach of the professor who goes into an arena to talk to students and so on, which he loves doing. But his leadership when it comes to people is actually very poor. His sense of communication with people is very, very poor. It's all about Macron. Now, looking on the other side, Jordan Bardella is, I think he could be described as being streetwise. He's a man who is 28 years old who grew up in one of the very poor suburbs of Paris, a suburb where at times the police would not even go into because of the security risk. So he's very streetwise. Also, his mother is Italian, very conservative. His father left when he was young. So Bardella grew up in a very conservative, religiously conservative environment in an area notorious for violence, where immigration has been playing a key role there. I think that Bardella would work with Macron because ultimately Bardella will look at the bigger picture. How would Macron work with Bardella is a question. And I think we already are realizing that there are profound differences, not just politically, we know that, but in the makeup of the individuals there. 2022, they had 18% of the vote at the end of the first round. They got twice as much now. But also, we have a group of parties from the left side of politics in France, ecology, socialist, and so on, who's been created for the sake of having a union for this election. So it is as dysfunctional as it could ever be, because those leaders of those various parties, there's 6 of them, normally could never work together. But now they are in the coalition to ensure that Rassemblement National does not succeed. So the question is, what happened after that? And what I can see is chaos for quite some time, and probably chaos until the presidential election in 2027.
Coming back to this nation of chaos, I think this most recent round of results overwhelmingly show that French voters are deserting the centre and they're sort of segmenting further onto either end of the political spectrum. Given your expertise in political violence, do you see with this growing schism and fragmentation potential risks for increased political violence or social unrest following this election?
President Macron last week warned that there could be civil war in France. I don't agree with that. My concern, though, would be if a movement of Macron's supporters, the Front Populaire and others, is created to prevent Jordan Bardella from becoming prime minister, then we could have a reaction in the street from the supporters of the RN, who historically have been associated with certain degree of violence. So it would not be a civil war, of course, but there could be some unrest. That is highly possible. And it could also work the other way. France is prone to unrest, demonstration and so on. That's the nature of French life. But here we're looking at something slightly different, where there could be anger, and we could actually experience maybe in a certain way a little bit of what happened in the US. So we could have that degree of polarization, and that could translate into some violence on the ground. I do not believe that it's going to be a civil war at all. That's not going to happen. But there will be tension, yes.
Well, I certainly hope that you're correct on the civil war front. Professor Bogais, thank you so much for joining us today on Leave It to the Experts.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
As all of this is happening in France, with calls of a potential civil war from the president himself, France is also organising its biggest celebration in decades. We're now just weeks away from the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympic Games. All eyes will be on Paris, giving the country a chance to show itself as a world leader in spectacle, sports and democracy. A display of soft power rarely rivalled, dominating the global media for weeks. Anything that goes wrong will potentially be seen by audiences from Paris to Paraguay. Hosting the Games is expected to cost France nearly €9 billion. That includes $1.4 billion alone poured into making Paris' Seine River clean enough for triathletes to swim in.
Paris has been working hard on cleaning up the Seine to make it swimmable again, as it was the case during the 1900s Paris Olympics.
See, the Seine is known for many things, but being clean isn't one of them. For more than 1,000 years, the river has been used for all sorts of activities, from dumping chemicals to waste. After all that investment to promote its cleanliness, Macron and Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo pledged to swim in the Seine on June 23rd.
Yes, I plan to swim in the Seine, that is clear, and I am preparing for this moment, which will be historic. If the president wants to come, he'll obviously be welcome too.
But the people had other ideas.
There's a hashtag that's trending on Twitter. The hashtag Je chie dans le Seine le 23 juin. What this means is, I shit in the Seine on June 23rd.
Social media was lit up by a viral protest movement threatening to defecate in Seine on the day of Macron and Hidalgo's swim. To paraphrase the protest's website, the politicians put Parisians in the mess, now it was time for them to bathe in it. The protest took issue not just with the costs spent on the Olympics while the French people suffered under a stagnant economy, but it's also about a fundamental distrust of Emmanuel Macron. Swimming in the Seine has been illegal since 1923, and it is filthy. Whenever Paris experiences heavy rain, its 19th century sewage system can be overwhelmed, spilling wastewater directly in the river. Macron and Hidalgo didn't wind up swimming on June 23rd. They blamed heavy rainfall in May and said they were focusing on the legislative elections, pledging to reschedule for mid-July. But it turns out Parisians didn't need to soil the Seine to undermine Macron's clean-up plan. On June 28th, a month before Olympians are supposed to freestyle through its waters, the Seine tested 10 times above the acceptable limit of E. coli. Just days ago, a rehearsal of the opening ceremony was cancelled due to unsafe water quality in the river. Still, Paris officials are adamant that the water will be ready by the end of July, despite all evidence raising doubts. But the quality of the river's water will matter little if the world watches on as Paris burns. Security and services in Paris are already stretched for the billion-dollar sporting carnival, and any civil unrest would test their reserves. Since the first round of elections, groups have taken to the streets, demonstrating against the potential vote for the national rally. But many of these protests are taking place in Paris, while the smaller towns and villages remained silent. President Macron is calling for the Republican Front, the very essence of French national pride, to avoid a potentially far right-wing, anti-immigration, anti-EU parliament running the country. Macron will take the victory if France avoids this outcome, but history may judge him differently for his role in allowing it to happen. That's it for this episode of Leave It to the Experts. Next episode, we'll look at the results of this election and that of the United Kingdom. For more of what we do, head to 360info.org. There you can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and understand our work to fight against misinformation with university experts worldwide. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Gaselli. Research by Amber Holden. Music by Jan Skubaszewski at Red Moon Studios. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.